There we go. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Got a couple folks on Zoom today. Good morning. And good morning to everybody in person. Gonna take roll real quick. Hopefully this will be the last week. I'm already like looking around and thinking I could probably do this, but I also don't want to like mark someone absent who's actually here because I don't trust my memory. So bear with me and I apologize. All right, Mia, Deja, Nora. Okay. Abby, Monica, okay. Sarah E, Miriam, Lauren, Makaya, Lyric, Onyx, India, Jalen, Daria, Ray. Make sure no one else signed on Zoom. Doesn't look like it. Okay. Heaven, Alex, Sarah P, Melissa, Antoinette, Linda, okay. Sequoia, and Grayson. And I know we've got some folks out today because it's a holiday, so understandably. Good morning, good morning. Remind me of your names.
Linda.
Linda, awesome. Okay, so before we dive back into our lecture about research methods, I wanted to take just a minute to kind of remind you of what's coming up and then also some of the stuff that's on Blackboard that'll hopefully be helpful to y'all. So you are here if we're looking at a map. So your first exam will be given out in 2 weeks. We got plenty of time between now and then. And don't forget, we'll have a whole review day. And then when the exam's passed out in class, you'll have time to ask me questions about it, etc. I have not graded the first Explain to the Media quiz yet. I plan to do that within the next couple of days, but I saw that a bunch of you already did it, so kudos. And just a reminder to keep up with these small assignments, just because A, they'll help you when you do get to the exam, and B, they're gonna sort of stack up eventually and you're gonna feel overwhelmed by them. But again, if you get them in a day or two late, that's okay, totally. All right, so looking over at Blackboard, just kind of reminding y'all of a couple things. So my lecture notes are all posted here. So if you're someone who struggles to keep up with how quickly I talk, understandable. I talk really fast. I try to slow down when I'm teaching y'all. Doesn't always happen. So having the notes so you can either print them out as a PDF or download them, you know, whatever works best for y'all. Then you can take notes that way, and people have often found that easier to follow along. Also, it's a nice way that like if you missed something and you prefer to either just type everything out or write it all out, you can go back and be like, what was that word? And take a look there. Couple other just quick reminders of what's where here. This is how you get to all your Connect assignments by clicking in through here. So like we're in chapter 2 now, and you can see the various assignments we have for that. Here are where the Explain It to the Media quizzes are. I've got the first 2 posted. I will post the rest throughout the semester. And then here is where you can find the recordings of my lecture. So I made a decision on Friday that will actually keep this better updated for y'all. What I've been doing the past couple of years is like uploading onto YouTube and then trying to remember to also put them on Blackboard after they're done processing. Now what you can do is just click right here and it will give you a playlist of all the recordings. And I have them just named by date. So if there's a date you miss, just go and click on it and you'll be able to find what you're looking for. So that was a decision to make things easier for both y'all and me that I made on Friday afternoon. So other quick things as we go throughout the semester, here will be where the information for that infographic project is. Your first assignment for that's not due for about a month, so we got some time. And then as we near the end of the semester, here's where you'll turn in those psychology experience credits. And then, you know, if you're on your page, here's where you would click and see your grades on the various assignments. So any questions about any logistics? I know when I've been meeting with folks individually, which I've been loving to get to know y'all, people have been saying it's pretty clear, which is good. There's a reason I have a 10-page syllabus. It's to try to make everything as clear as possible for y'all. But if there is ever anything that you're like, that doesn't make sense, feel free to either email me or please ask it in class, because if you have that question, probably like 5 other people do too. So, alrighty, well, I'm gonna jump back over to our lecture here. Close out a couple tabs. And we are talking about the ways that psychologists do research. And so let me get the Zoom ones out of the way because they're not as good as the Google ones. And so we are starting with the case study. And so case studies are where you study one person. So often this is someone you're in therapy with as a therapist. And it provides a detailed interpretive description of that person's life and psychological problems. And so we had talked about how these will be good inspiration for more research going forward. And I wanted to give you some examples of case studies. So one of the classic case studies is Little Hans. Little Hans was a young boy who was frightened by horses. And his dad took him to see Freud for therapy. Now this is kind of interesting because typically Freud didn't actually treat kiddos. He usually treated adults. So this is one of the few kiddos that is like extensively documented. Freud looked at this little kid, heard his whole story, thought about his fear of horses, and said, this is linked to the Oedipal complex. And if you're someone who hasn't taken psychology before, you don't know what that is. Quick sidebar, we'll go into this a lot more detail later, but essentially the Oedipal complex came from Oedipus Rex, and it was Freud's idea that little boys were attracted to their mothers, and yes, Freud meant sexually, as well as romantically, and that they saw their fathers as competition as a result. Now, one sort of side note I like to give context to this is Freud's mom was about 20 years younger than his dad, and by all accounts was actually quite pretty. So this is a good example of a case of someone saying, well, what happens to me must happen to everybody, right? And so Freud said that's why he's afraid of horses, the horses representing his father. And so he's afraid of it because of that. Freud saw the fact that little Hans had once seen a horse fall in the street right next to him and being terrified about this experience as insignificant. Okay, so this kind of shows you where some of that bias can come into play in a case study. Different example of a case study, Alois Alzheimer. Near the early 1900s, he described a patient exhibiting symptoms of forgetfulness, disorientation, and a general decline in level of functioning. The patient he described was later referred to as having Alzheimer's disease. So even though we knew people had these symptoms, if you remember from our history, the word dementia was around with the ancient Greeks. Alzheimer was the first one to describe this specific set of dementia symptoms that we now call Alzheimer's disease. So case studies can also be to give that nomothetic understanding, that initial description of a new disorder. So if we go back to, if you remember, we're using the example of eating because everybody eats, and also it's my research. So recall that we're interested in investigating the relationship between negative emotions and binge eating, that eating a large amount of food in a short amount of time with a sense of loss of control. So if we were going to do a case study here, what we'd probably do is, interview someone who's presenting problem for therapy is binge eating. I have her here, and typically we do think of people with eating disorders as female. But in fact, if we're looking purely at binge eating disorder, it's about 40% of the cases are men, right? And then we know that there's unfortunately a high rate of disordered eating among individuals who are trans and non-binary as well because of their complicated relationships with their body. So I'm using her here, but imagine it could be a person of any gender. So we would take a psychosocial history, get to know about the person, and maybe she says that when she was growing up, she lived with her mom and her grandma, and her mom worked outside the home, so her grandma was caregiver after school, and grandma baked a lot. And whenever she came home feeling sad or upset, grandma would bake and exclaim, "Eat, eat, you'll feel better," right? So as a psychologist, you're thinking when she was a kid, she ate whenever she experienced negative emotions. That could be one of the bases of her binging now, and you might write that up as an example case. Whenever I tell this story, I think of my Polish grandmother, who's unfortunately now deceased, but would just stand and say, "Eat, eat," and tell us to eat more. So all of these different types of research methods we're going to talk about have different limitations, things that make them something we have to be cautious, cautious about. So as we saw with the example of Freud, you could have bias on the part of the observer, but also on the part of the client or the reporter. So for example, little Hans's father was a huge fan of Freud. So in addition to scientific papers, some of Freud's work was published more generally. And so little Hans's father tended to report information that supported Freud's theories when he brought his kiddo in. And he would de-emphasize the information that wasn't related to Freud's theories. And how this could play out in a normal case, especially if we're thinking of someone you're seeing for therapy, is you generally as a client, if things are going well in therapy, you feel a bond with your therapist, right? And so you might want to please your therapist, even unintentionally, and kind of say things that go with the way your therapist is thinking. Case studies also rely on subjective evidence, right? Sort of one person's reporting and one person's interpretation of that, rather than objective things that we can directly observe. And this means that case studies have low internal validity. So what that means, internal validity is essentially the accuracy with which we can rule out all other possible causes, right? So if we take the example we were just talking about of the girl with her grandmother, right? So we might say, aha, this is why she binge eats now. And then we might ignore the fact that when mom came home, she was always getting on their daughter about what she ate and her weight, right? And that probably factored in too. Case studies also provide little basis for generalization because you're just talking about one person and there are what, 7+ billion people on the earth, right? And so the idea that like one person will generalize to everybody can be really problematic. This means that case studies also have low external validity, and external validity is just a fancy psychological way of saying generalization. So this is a little bit circular. Alrighty, so the more rigorous method, and in fact, one that has become sort of one of 2 gold standards of how we do research in the field is the correlational method. So what the correlational method allows us to do is to examine the degree to which events, characteristics, ideas, constructs, variables, whatever you want to call them, things, right, vary with each other. So it essentially measures the strength of a relationship between 2 variables. And the variables are assessed as they exist in nature. We're not trying to manipulate them in any way. We're not trying to, come in and say, look at this, and then feel something out, right? We're just getting them as they exist in nature. So a good basic example of a correlational study is having someone fill out a questionnaire about stress and one about depression. And then you examine how the variables relate. So in this case, you're not making the subject stressed. And we can actually, there are ethical ways we can stress out participants in studies. So one of the things that we can do is give them math problems and tell them to solve them, but they're actually like unsolvable. I know, it's sketchy, right? We always, if we are using deception like that, we always debrief them and tell them like, no one would be able to solve this, it's all good. And there are also ways, believe it or not, we can induce probably not depression, but at least sadness in an experiment. And one of the ways we do that is just having people listen to sad songs or watching sad movie clips. And then again, ethical obligation at the end to not only inform them that's what we're doing, but also to like bring them out of that sadness. So often you have them watch a happy movie clip at the end. But with a correlational study, you're not doing any of that. You're just having the person, like if I was doing a correlational study on stress and depression, I could just pass out questionnaires to everyone in this room after your informed consent, get how you're feeling right now, and that's my study. Perhaps, I have in my notes, one of the most important things, the most important thing to remember about correlation is that it doesn't imply causation. And so what this means is if you know 2 things are correlated, you cannot say one causes the other. So let's say we find out stress and depression are related. The higher you are on your stress level, the higher your levels of depression. We can't say one is causing the other because it could be you're really stressed out, overwhelmed about, I don't know, school, and that's causing you to also feel depressed. But it could also be you're depressed, and one of the symptoms of depression is a lack of motivation, hard to get out of bed. And so you're stressed because you're not getting stuff done. Or it could be a third thing going on. Maybe someone close to you has just passed away and you're helping arrange the funeral, right? So that's stress and depression for the same reason that we're not even measuring. And so correlation does not imply causation. This is the thing the media gets wrong the most when reporting on science. So you will see things like the local news being like, a recent study came out and says that eating 5 chocolate bars a day will prolong your life by 20 years. And it was like a big study where they looked at a lot of variables and there happened to be a correlation between those 2 things. And often it's like 5 other things are actually related to it, right? But because it sounds really cool, right? The media tends to be like, well, this means this causes that. Really good example of this. And to be honest, the scientific community made this assumption for years too, and we finally backed up on it, is thinking about breastfeeding and child intelligence and thriving. So for years and years, I said, you know, if you breastfeed, that means your kid's gonna do better in school and be healthier and yada, 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 yada. But what they realized when they finally started looking at socioeconomic status, you know, like where people are in terms of how much money they have, is that a lot of times the people who are not able to breastfeed are the people who are working hourly jobs, who don't get any maternity leave, have to go back right away. They aren't getting breaks to go pump, right? And so they're actually, it's not that the lack of breastfeeding is causing those inequalities, it's everything else that goes with being lower income, right? It's the fact that schools in our country are often paid for by property taxes. So if you're in an area where the property isn't as expensive, you're gonna have fewer resources, right? It's things like, unfortunately, as we know, in the US, a lot of the folks who are in poverty are experiencing all kinds of discrimination for their socioeconomic status, unfortunately, due to our systematic inequalities for years and years and years, centuries, right? 1619 is when we first had slaves brought here, you know, trafficked here, if we're going to use modern terms, right? That, you know, people of color are more likely to be there as well, and they're experiencing other inequalities as well. And we know that things like experiencing racism, experiencing classism can influence how well things go too. Simple things like your parents having time to sit down and read with you, right? That sounds so simple, but if your parent has to work 3 jobs just to put food on the table and pay the rent, they're not gonna have time, not because they don't want to, right? But just because they're just trying to like sneak in some sleep, right? So all this to say, we've pulled back, and when they there are ways that we can statistically put all those things in the equation. And when we do that, I think the only thing that actually benefits from breastfeeding is like gastrointestinal issues, which like intuitively makes sense, right? And in fact, that's not across the board. There are kids who are like essentially allergic, lactose intolerant to their mother's milk, right? And can't take it for that reason. So again, the scientific community for years gave this recommendation, you've got to breastfeed, but like we're realizing more and more like fed is best, just like get your kid nutrition, formula, breast milk, however you're doing it, right? But we have to remind ourselves constantly that just because we found a relationship between variables with the correlation doesn't mean one causes the other. It's also important to consider the magnitude of the correlation. So the correlation is represented by a number, and that number is represented by a lowercase r. And it can range, and it's called the correlation coefficient. And it can range from +1 to -1. And our intuitive gut from all our years of math is to say, okay, well, -1 is the weakest correlation then. But in fact, with correlation, 0 is the weakest correlation. And on the next couple slides, I'll kind of explain what positive versus negative means. But essentially, +1 and -1 are equally strong. 0 just means 0 correlation. There's no relationship between these variables. So the closer correlation is to either -1 or +1, the stronger that relationship is. So here are some diagrams, hopefully walk you through this. So this is the example we've been using of depression and stress. This is a positive correlation. So as you score higher on stress, you also score higher on depression. Okay. So that is, I think, easily understood, kind of gut, that makes sense, right? The one that can trip some people up is negative correlation. So if I were to kind of toggle back and forth here, right, these are a mirror image of each other, right? So this line is the same slope as this line, just in the opposite direction. So it's an equally strong correlation. And here we're looking at depression and your level of activity. And so people who are scoring higher on depression are engaging in fewer activities. And again, here we have to be cautious, right, about causality. So that would be, well, they're depressed, so they're not doing anything. Yeah, that is a symptom of depression, but we also know that it's sort of circular, that if you're not doing activities, you're not experiencing the pleasure, and that's just going to contribute to your depression. And also this could be caused by a third thing. Maybe, unfortunately, you were in a really bad car accident and you're laid up in the hospital, right? So you're not able to do activities, but you're also depressed, right? And so this is a negative correlation. And so what that means is as one variable goes up, the other one goes down, but that their relationship can still be very strong. And here's that 0 or no correlation. So depression and IQ not related. You can be depressed if you experience developmental delays. You can be depressed if you are the world's best super genius, right? They are not related at all. So that's a correlation of 0. There are also several extensions of the correlational method, different things we can do to use this methodology to answer more complicated questions. One of these is epidemiological studies. So we typically think of epidemiology as being about physical illnesses, right? So we think about things like COVID or HIV/AIDS, things along those lines. But in fact, you can do epidemiological studies looking at psychological disorders as well. And so you might look at the incidence, which is the number of new cases that emerge during a given time, or the prevalence, which is the number of cases that exist in a population right now. So the way I remember this, because I always mess these up, incidence, there's an N in it. I know it's dumb, but incidence, new and new. Number of new cases, prevalence is just how many cases do we have right now. So again, to think about this with COVID, incidence would be how many people tested positive this week. Prevalence would be how many people are just positive right now across the country or in Virginia Beach, whatever we want to look at. The chart down here in the corner is the prevalence, I believe. I want to make sure I get it right. Yes, the prevalence of depression among different age groups and different genders. So the red bar is female, the blue bar is male. And you'll see that unfortunately it kind of spikes for folks y'all's age, particularly for women. And actually this is an older chart. It'd be interesting to kind of look at it now because unfortunately we are seeing higher rates of depression among the elderly now. And then there's also what are called longitudinal studies. And so these are where you observe the same people on many occasions over a long period of time. So people often do this with kids. You get kids at age 2, age 4, age 6, et cetera, right? And this allows you to kind of track things over time. And this is especially where the news media and even scientists get tempted to say one thing causes the other, because you can say, oh, if this happened at time 1, then we saw this rise at time 2. Well, they were really stressed at time 1, then they were more likely to be depressed at time 2. It's still a correlation, and people's lives are very complicated, right? So there could be a whole bunch of other things going on that causes that change. But because it's over time, longitudinal studies are often very large populations. I remember when I was learning stats in grad school, we were using a longitudinal data set, and I think it had 3,000 people in it initially, but there are ones with tens of thousands of people in it. Often psychological studies have samples of 60 to 200, so that is quite large. And I'm just remembering, granted, this was 2004 level technology, but it would take forever just to run anything. This stats program had to go through all these people, right? So our professor eventually gave us a smaller subset of this data set to work with because it just was a little too overwhelming. So lots of different things we can do based on the correlational method. So again, think of an example here. We might have participants complete a food diary. So a food diary, and I feel old when I'm like, back in my day, we used to give these out in paper. Ooh. But now a lot of times these are embedded in an app and people will just complete them for their therapist that way. And so you record the types and quantities of food you consume, along with other questions. So things about their mood and how they were feeling about their eating. Did they feel like that was a binge, for example? So here are some of the key questions you might have included on that food diary. Indicate the type of mood you were experiencing before you ate, right? Were you happy, sad, not just negative, but also was it anger or annoyance or boredom, what was going on? And then indicate whether you feel like this was a binge eating episode. And then if yes, rate how severe that binge was. And so then you can look at the relationship between mood and the occurrence and severity of the binge. And you can express that as a correlation. Alrighty, next we're going to start talking about the experimental method. An experiment allows for determination of a causal relationship between those two or sometimes more variables. In order to do that, an experiment requires us to use a lot of different techniques. So one is random assignment. So let's say I have an experiment where I have two groups. One, I'm going to be, hate the word, but manipulating, right? I'm doing something to them in the lab. And the other one is our control group. They're not getting that manipulation. Okay, so anyone who comes in to do the experiment, you're going to be randomly assigned to one of those two. I'm not going to put all the women in one and all the men in other, and all the young people in one and all the old people in the other, right? And then we have that thing we're manipulating, the independent variable. We believe this is causal. We believe that if we change that independent variable, it's going to cause people to be different. So thinking of the example I gave earlier, if I give my participants unsolvable math problems, I believe that their stress level will increase, right? And that stress level in this case would be the dependent variable, the variable we assume to be controlled or influenced by what we're manipulating, by that independent variable. So the independent variable is what we're manipulating, the dependent variable is what we're measuring. So a big part of what we want to do in these types of studies is try to eliminate as many confounds or nuisance variables. Means the same thing, different people call it different things. And these are variables other than the independent variable that can skew results. They can also affect the dependent variable. So let's say I'm doing a study about attention. And my manipulation is I have you come in, I tell you about a big news event that just happened, and then I have you do the task. And the control group doesn't hear about the news event. Can they pay attention? What are other things that I'm not manipulating that could influence how well someone can pay attention on a task? Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah. How hot it is. Are you sweating while you're trying to do it? Are you freezing while you're trying to do it? Yeah. What are other things that can influence how well you can pay attention? Exactly, yeah. I have a colleague who actually had to throw out like half a semester's worth of data because she had someone running it for her at another site, and they disclosed to her that there's construction going on right outside the window of the room. And she was like, well, clearly we can't get an accurate, attention thing if we're got construction. I used to go to, there used to be at towns that are above where the Lululemon is now, there used to be a gym there. And I remember doing yoga when they were constructing one of the buildings. So you're like laying in Savasana and it's like, it's like, ooh, how relaxing, right? Yeah, so that's gonna throw you off. What are other things that can throw off, how well you can pay attention?
Just like how we feel.
Yeah, how you feel in the moment. So like, is the person upset about something else? Did they get enough sleep? Did they get enough caffeine this morning? Are they hungry? Right? So all those different things can influence it. And so ideally, as a researcher, you try to account for as many of those as you can, right? And you try to control them. And so you try to eliminate these nuisance variables, these compounds. But stuff's always going to still happen. You could have the perfect testing environment and like someone down the hall burn some popcorn, right? And the fire alarm goes off. Well, you're gonna have to check that person's data, right? Unfortunately. Alrighty. So how do we do this? How do we guard against compounds? One of the ways we do it is with that control group I mentioned. So they're a group of participants who are going to go through basically the same thing as the experimental group, but just not get that manipulation, not get exposure to the independent variable. And so then the idea is by comparing the outcome of the control group, the outcome of the experimental group, we should be able to determine the effect of the independent variable. And why random assignment is so important to these groups is because, again, it tries to eliminate some of those compounds so you don't end up with everyone with ADHD in one group, things along those lines. In general, random assignment will balance out all that stuff over time. And so, again, sort of, some people still do this, but certainly it used to be you just did a coin flip, or when participants came in, you would have a jar and have them pick a number out of it, and that would be the group they were in. Nowadays, a lot of times what we do is we use a random number generator. So there's a really good free one called random.org. I actually use it when I make tests because you can randomize like ABCD basically and make sure like we as people have a tendency to make all the answers like B or C because we feel like that'll be harder or something. And that eliminates that bias basically, right? So you can use that and it'll tell you, okay, the first person that's coming in today is going to be number 1. That's your experimental group. Second person's number 2. Third person's number 2. Fourth person's number 1, right? We can also look at, if we're doing something like, let's say, a therapy trial or a drug trial. There are psychotropic medications, anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants, things along those lines. And we might do what's called placebo therapy. And so the idea here is we're going to substitute an imitation, something that looks or feels or tastes like that medication, or we try to do this with therapy too, although as you can imagine, it's hard to construct a therapy placebo. But it's not, right? So the quickest way to imagine this is in drug trials. Half the group will get the actual medication, the other half will get a sugar pill that's made to look exactly like the actual medication. And so why we do this is to get rid of experimenter bias, which is sometimes called the Rosenthal effect. Basically, experimenters have expectations, and even if you are the most professional, well-meaning scientist, you can unintentionally transmit your expectations to your participants. You could have a script even, and you can read the same words, but let's say you came in and I said, I think this medication is really going to help you. Make sure you take it every day on time. Or I can say, I think this medicine is really going to help you. And make sure you take it every day on time, right? And again, it's probably not that extreme, but just those small bits can tell people a lot about what you're actually expecting. And so the way that we try to account for this are blind designs. And so single blind design is where the participant themselves doesn't know if they're getting the real treatment or the placebo, the actual medication or the sugar pill. Okay, but that doesn't account for that researcher bias still, right? So that's where we might use a double blind design. So this would be the person who's in the room giving them the medication also doesn't know whether they're getting the actual medication or the sugar pill. You might be like, how does that work? Don't they need to know? There would be someone behind the scenes, the principal investigator, who would know, but like the researcher would come in that day and they would just be like, you're giving everybody A today, you know? And so they wouldn't know which one they're giving. You can also do a triple blind design. So a lot of times with therapy or with medication, we're also going to be doing some sort of behavioral observation. So bringing it back around to attention, imagine we're giving a new ADHD medication versus a sugar pill, right? We might have someone who watches a tape of the kiddo with ADHD and rates their behaviors in terms of like how fidgety were they, things like that. Now, sometimes the problem is even, again, with all these things in place, people are fairly smart and they can figure stuff out. So I had a graduate professor who told us about working on one of these trials for ADHD, although it was like day by day, they would, I think because we know ADHD meds are so effective, like not giving them at all can be unethical. And he said the kids would come in and just be like, it's a placebo day. Like the kids would know, right? Which I think is really effective. It's obvious. But this can be, you know, again, ways to try to eliminate all those different confounds. And one of the reasons why placebo therapy works, the idea of giving someone a sugar pill or having them just come in and talk to someone rather than doing like actual therapeutic steps, is because we know that if you tell people something's going to help them, they get hope and they start to actually feel better already before even taking it. So by doing this, it essentially lets us see, do they actually get better over and above what you would get just from that hope? Is the medication actually helping over and above that, right? And this is why actually for a lot of therapy trials, the control group is what we call a wait list control. And that's just, they're told, you're going to get the therapy, you're on a wait list, so start it in 6 weeks. Again, to see over and above that hope and excitement that I'm going to get help, does the actual therapy help that? And again, that gets to the heart of like, it's unethical not to give someone therapy if we know it works, right? And so for that reason, in modern times, because we've done a lot of like this type of basic research already, you'll often see like the therapy, the new therapy is being compared to like not just waitlist control, but to an existing therapy that we also know works. Or like, for example, I am in the clinical trial for the new Moderna booster that's variant specific that just came out. And because they know those boosters work, it was unethical for them not to give us anything. So they just gave 3 different strains. And I still don't know which strain I got. So, you know, just sort of seeing what works the best and, but also being ethical and not like causing people to die, things along those lines. And there have been, unfortunately, times in the past, not only psychologists, but also other scientists have been unethical in this area. So the clearest example, unfortunately, I can think of is the Tuskegee experiments. So if you're not familiar with these, they purposely infected specifically Black men, I believe it was herpes, and did not treat them. And they did this for years, even after they knew antibiotics and other medications would treat it. They purposely didn't treat them to see what would happen. They knew what would happen, right? So that is an example where medical science, again, we would think there's no bias in medical science, right? There's a great book in psychology called Even the Rat Was White, talking about how a lot of times we didn't even study people of color. And it could be called Even the Rat Was White and Male, because until like the 70s or 80s, we weren't even studying women either. Much less non-binary people, queer people, etc. All right, so let's think about this with binge eating. So one of the things that we will sometimes do is have people be very slightly deprived. We're not going to starve them for days, but we're going to say, hey, for the 4 hours or 8 hours before you come in for this experiment, don't eat anything. So you're going to be hungry, right? So we might hypothesize that people who have been deprived of food will eat more than people who have not been deprived. I mean, that just makes intuitive sense, right? So our independent variable will be whether or not we instructed people to deprive themselves of food. And our dependent variable would be the amount of food consumed. And so these studies are actually pretty ingenious. What they'll do is like weigh all the food beforehand and then weigh all the food after the person leaves, and you can see how much the person actually consumed. And so our question here will be, will the amount of food consumed change as the result of the manipulation of that independent variable here, food deprivation? So our experimental group would be the people we told, hey, don't eat for 4 hours before you come in. Our control group would be the people who we didn't give any instruction, ad lib, eat as usual. Now, one thing that's kind of important here, if we're again thinking about reducing confounds, is we would want to make sure when people come in, we ask them, did you actually refrain from eating? Right? People are not always the best at following instructions. Even, people who are told, don't eat before your surgery because you're gonna have anesthesia and we don't want you to throw up in the middle of the surgery, right? So you want to check and make sure, did people actually follow your directions? You also want to make sure that your control group didn't not eat, right? So maybe they were just really busy that day. We've all had those days where you're running around and then like 5 hours later, you're like, why am I so hungry? Oh, I didn't eat anything today, right? Or you need to make sure you're not getting people who are fasting for religious reasons, things along those lines, right? So you would want to make sure you ask those questions. You also want to make sure these two groups are randomly assigned, made up of similar participants. So if we put, again, like we think about putting all the men in the food deprived group and all the women in the ad lib group, now we can't decide if it's actually determined by gender or by our instructions, right? And we also know there's a lot of really interesting sociocultural ideas about acceptability of food and eating, right? Where women are supposed to eat small like a bird, and men, it's not always, but often considered more acceptable to eat a lot. And so we need to make sure we're randomly assigning by gender. And things like being an athlete, right? Athletes often consume more calories because they have to fuel their bodies, right? So we want to make sure all the athletes don't end up in one group or another. So our hypothesis, people who binge eat will be more likely to engage in binge eating rather than in response to negative moods rather than neutral moods. So this would be, if we take back to our original, so this would be a new experiment. So this one, our hypothesis would be people who are food deprived are going to eat more. That's pretty easy. But if we go back to people who binge eat will be more likely to binge eat in response to negative moods than neutral moods. Now we're going to get into some of that manipulation that I was talking about with depression. And so there are different ways you can do this, as I mentioned. And one of these is, as I mentioned, sad music, sad movie clips, things along those lines. And so this, I really like this diagram because it gives you a good example of how they do everything the same except for the IV, right? So you're going to get people who already binge eat, you're going to screen them beforehand, and you're going to randomly assign them to the two groups. You're going to assess their mood when they come in, get a baseline. And then you're going to give them this induction, some sort of experimental manipulation to make the experimental group induce some depressed mood, the bingers neutral mood, or the control group, they're all bingers. And then you're going to reassess the mood, and you might also, just like we did in the last study, assess food intake. All right, so here is another example of how you could manipulate depressed mood. So these are called the Velton mood cards, and they're just statements you have people read. I feel a little low today. Every now and then I just feel so tired and gloomy, I'd rather sit than do anything. I feel somewhat discouraged and drowsy. Maybe I'll need a nap when I get home. People are fairly suggestible, so even just reading statements like this can make you feel a little worse, right? It's not going to make you go into full-blown depressive episode, but it could make you feel a little worse. For the control group, what you'll see is that you've got very neutral ones, just sort of factoids, basically. Japan was elected to the United Nations almost 4 years after Pearl Harbor. At the end appears a section entitled Bibliography and Notes, right? Just neutral things, factoids, things along those lines. Alrighty, so we'll end there for today. And on Wednesday, I'll explain sort of how that would pan out within a study.